Americans are not having babies anymore. The U.S. fertility rate fell to a record low, declining 2% from a year ago, according to the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC. This marks the lowest rate recorded since the government began tracking the data in the 1930s. It continues a trend of American women either delaying or foregoing having children altogether. Greater access to contraception, prioritizing their careers, and economic instability due to student loans or high home prices are all reasons why women may be opting out for different decisions, or may be opting rather for different decisions from their parents.
Women 40 and older were the only group whose birth rate actually increased from the year prior, though the number of births still lower than any other age group. The U.S. rate had previously remained under or around 2.1 children per woman since the 1970s, and in 2023, the rate was 1.62. And a lower birth rate could have a major impact on American culture in general. And so, I look at this number, Amber, and immediately I'm like, oh, it's all of the stuff that's in our food that's bad for us, all these crazy hormones, it's messing with our bodies. I also think about, the access to healthcare that people have. And I think, our healthcare has improved over the years, and especially women's healthcare, right? Our ability to access, a gynecologist who has proper training, and the advancements in the field of gynecology since the 1930s have been tremendous. And so I don't know, to me, without looking at a pool of evidence and data, I really immediately, my mind goes to our food and the antibiotics given to livestock and the pesticides in crops. That's immediately where my brain goes. What about you?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I do think that declining fertility is part of it, but there's also a difference in the choices that women are making as well. And when you talk to, or when you poll women who decide to have children later in life, a lot of them talk about the fact that they basically wanted to prioritize their career. They wanted to make a lot of money and get really comfortable before they decided to settle down and raise their kids. And then a lot of them want to return to work after they have children. So maybe they're having fewer children. Daycare and childcare prices are pretty high. They're skyrocketing now. So if you want to go back to work or have to go back to work, that is basically eating up your entire paycheck. And so I think it's a combination of sort of economic and cultural changes between women being more likely to go to college than men, more likely to enter the workforce and have a high-paying career. And then the expenses that come with having a child have really turned a lot of women off from being, 22 years old and starting a family, which is, I think, what probably a lot of our parents did. And it's kind of unfortunate because you'll see these sort of anecdotal stories from women who say that they genuinely did not know or were not taught that when they got over the age of 35 or 40, that it was going to be incredibly difficult for them to have a viable pregnancy. And they express a lot of regret about the fact that they didn't try to have a family sooner. So I think we're setting a lot of women up for failure by advancing this lie that they can have, 10 to 15 years in their career and then they can just have as many kids as they want. I mean, the biological clock, as icky as it may sound, is 100% real. And I think we need to be more honest with women about really what their options are. And, from the economic standpoint, too, this is a great reminder of why we need to continue to work to return to a society that can allow families to thrive on a single income. It shouldn't be a requirement that women have to work in order to raise a family, that you have to have a two-income household. A lot of women would choose to stay at home with their children if they had the choice, but many feel, for whatever reason, that they have to continue to work. And some women might forgo having children if they feel like, I'm just gonna have to put him in daycare anyway, so what's really the point if I don't even get to spend time with my family, if I have to work harder to make sure that I can afford all of their necessities. There's so many complicating factors here, and it's really sad, because when you do these polls of women and men too, they consistently say that they are happier when they are married and then even happier when they have children. So it's something that we really need to prioritize from a public policy perspective to make sure that people are able to have the families that they want and deserve.
Absolutely, yeah. I think about the fertility question, my brain goes to the government's letting the food industry kill us. But when I think about when it's, a choice, a deliberate choice, and maybe not the choice you want to make, but a choice you make due to limited options, mostly due to financial constraints. We look at the economy since the 1930s. We've seen inflation-adjusted wages create a scenario where, due to exorbitantly high prices and lower wages relative to productivity, we're really seeing people compensated less and have far less purchasing power with those wages. A huge part of that is inflation driven by the housing market. We've seen the price of a home increase over 120% since the 1930s. I think most people, when they think about having kids, they want to have a place to do it. They want to have a steady home. They don't want to have, an apartment or be a renter where they could potentially be evicted, where a lot of their money isn't going into something permanent, where their family can be raised into adulthood. And I just think high housing prices in general have been, a calculation people make. Well, if I'm giving X amount of my income to this, how much money do I realistically have left for healthcare for me, my partner, our kids? How much money do I have left to feed the kids or pay for daycare if they have to work as well? And I've always said that it's a feminist thing for women to have all of these options. There was an interesting wave of feminism. I almost call it like the liberal Hillary Clinton brand of feminism, where it's like, you have to work and this is the culture and you should girl boss and put on a pantsuit and work the job. But that's really not giving women the chance to have a full life. It's like, if you want to be respected, you have to be exactly what the man was during the most toxic era of patriarchy. And that's just not realistic. When we think about human life, a woman should have the option to stay home and recover from a pregnancy. That's a very progressive idea, that when you go through the traumatic experience physically and mentally and emotionally of childbirth, that you should have time to recover. So that means the household would require, a single worker or a single parent should have the kind of insulation where, God forbid, something were to happen to her partner, that she's able to raise the baby okay. I've talked to a lot of pro-life women, in the rural South, and they say things like, the biggest reason for abortion is women don't have the resources they need and the community needs to step in, which is a very progressive thing to say. But it's true that many people have this sentiment of, we need to care for families, we need to care for mothers.
Yeah, and I love that point you brought up about how a lot of the third wave feminists were actually quite anti-feminist if they're going by this definition of allowing women to have choices available to them. There was this period of time in the 2000s mostly where it was really frowned upon for women to be stay-at-home mothers. There even is still a lot of commentary today about the idea that women who choose to stay at home and not work are essentially trapped, like their husband is naturally going to betray them and they need to be stocking away money secretly in case they have to flee, because there's like this perception that that people who have traditional households are going to be more likely to be abused. And it's a really unfortunate and quite pessimistic way of viewing a partnership like the one that is a marriage. And there's this weird commentary too that you were talking about, which is that if women are to be empowered or equal to men, that they have to behave like men. And that's so toxic and really ignores the innate differences between men and women in the way that they complement one another. This idea that women need to work like men and be slaves to corporations, that they need to have sex like men through hookup culture in order to reach their full potential, has actually been quite damaging to women and has convinced a lot of them that they are not supposed to want to be a mom or stay home with their kids or take care of the house, that those things are considered somehow less than building a powerful career. And I wanted to get a little bit more into some of the cultural reasons for women delaying having children or not having children at all as well, because there's a couple of recent, more trendy things that have been popping up through social media where some people say that they don't want to have children because they think it's bad for the environment, because the earth is overpopulated or something. Sounds a bit Thanos to me, but some people believe it. And then there's the rise of the DINK, which is the double income no kids. And you see them posting a lot on TikTok about how much free time they have and how they have money for all of these activities. And I watch their videos and I have to admit, they seem a little bit empty to me. And I don't appreciate the narrative that parents' lives are over after they have kids. Like, they're not allowed to do anything fun anymore. They're constantly poor, they're miserable, they don't get enough sleep, and they're constantly fighting with one another. And the dinks seem to often throw these jabs at parents like their lives are not as fulfilling as, you know, the people who get to go out to dinner every evening and have a cocktail and not have to worry about the kids at home. I think that is so strange to me. And when we see the decline in meaning for young people and purpose-filled lives, you see a rise in anxiety and depression and all of these underlying mental illnesses. It's hard for me not to connect that with the fact that people are getting married later in life, having children later in life, and also are less religious and maybe are missing that higher purpose, that higher calling that really can bring purpose and fulfillment to their life.
A few things you said there, just super good points. I think about all the time that there's not a lot of activities for parents with kids to go do all together, because a lot of the culture around hanging out as adults revolves around drinking, revolves around going to bars, which are not good places for kids. I think about hanging out with my friends who have kids, and we just go to their house and hang out at their house. And that's become such an uncommon form of hanging out among adults. It's very consumer based. And it's almost an intentional cultural shift that's been made partially through advertising and the normalization of just consumer culture on social media due to, I don't know, maybe the rise of influencers or maybe the influence of advertisements on people. But I really think that if we had more community spaces, it would be a lot easier to be social and be a parent and not feel like your life is over. I think the degradation or degradation of communities is really, what I deem to be the cause of this. And I think about this Malthusian theory, right? The idea that we're in a time where we're overpopulating the earth, we don't have enough resources to go around. At a time, it was a very popular theory in the social sciences, and then it was deemed to be a ridiculous theory. That actually the reason we're in the place we are is because major corporations are polluting the planet and causing environmental destruction, and we can actually be sustainable if we choose to opt for more sustainable models going forward. That actually this isn't a scenario where people are at fault for having children. And in fact, I think it's a great act of resistance to still have kids and say, actually, no. Just because you're hoarding a bunch of wealth and resources and destroying the planet doesn't mean that our bloodlines are going to die. How ridiculous if we were to let that happen. But I think a lot of people envision an apocalyptic world, or a world where climate change really does result in mass destruction, water wars, where their kids will have a much worse life than them and will be living in a time of famine. I actually think that at a time when we see the current power structures, break down because of climate catastrophe, I envision communities coming together more, and instead of relying on like big corporate grocery stores, people coming together to start community farms. I think we apply a lot of the rules and norms of monopoly capitalism to a post-apocalyptic world instead of envisioning, okay, what would life be like if we didn't have the greediest people providing our food and healthcare, and what if communities actually came together and rebuilt? I think it would look a little bit differently than how a lot of the apocalypse movies envision it.
That's a very interesting perspective. And just to really quick before we wrap, go back to your point about the sort of degradation of socialization between parents with children, or even just young adults and their friends who have children. I think that is really important. I see a lot of chatter from people all over social media being really quite sneering and nasty towards parents who bring their kids to social places or even just in public. And I always try to remind myself, just on a personal level, to show a lot of patience and grace towards parents. It's easy for all of us to say that we'd be like the perfect parents and our kids would never cry on the airplane, right? But the reality is that babies and toddlers don't comply with everything that you want them to do. And I think just as a society, we need to exercise a little bit more grace for people who are really doing their best with the challenge presented to them. And is it really the worst thing to have to deal with a crying baby for 15 minutes when that is actually that person's life? So I agree with you 100% that we need to be a little bit kinder to to parents who do want to go out and bring their kids with them and try to, by the way, it's a great thing for kids too, to be introduced to society and kind of learn how the world works. So everybody keep that in mind. We'll be back with more Rising after this.